Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody in between or beyond. This is your instructor Michael speaking. This is a summary or repetition of our last lecture dealing with Viking Age arts and crafts with a particular focus on the visual arts. The reason for this repetition is that the information might of relevance for the upcoming workshop and or also for the take-home exam in this course on the Viking Age. So I would like you to take out your handouts and to try to read along while you are following this video. I started this lecture with a few examples of Viking Age visual art that derive or survived in different media, that is wooden media like stave churches and boats from Norway, or an axe from Mammen in Denmark that stands in for different metalwork. I also gave you a textile fragment from the Oseberg tapestries in Norway that is the same grave as the boat comes from to the left. There's also some metalwork combined with leather deriving from Gotland again, from a place called Berua. Below we will see a picture stone that stands for any kind of stone masonry, and further below there is a shrine deriving from Kamin in what today is northern Poland, made of different materials that have been sourced from different places. And this is important as insofar as materials and gestures involved in these craft processes may contribute to different layers of meaning that these ready designs have in their final state, connected by different networks of trade and exchange. An important thing we need to remind ourselves when encountering any kind of art, be it prehistoric or modern, is the fact that there is a conceptual difference between a mental image that could be the source of some design and the final product that we might describe as a design. A design is usually the product of a mental image that is materialized by gestures. So this simply means we have a craftsperson who has learned a choreography of different movements that help them to shape these materials, and the final product is the design. And this is important insofar as both materials and gestures do contribute to different layers of meaning that might be important when we try to understand the pictorial product. In art research terms, one usually divides in between the layer of denotation, that simply means what the picture is saying, and a layer of connotation, which relates to the impact and significance of the whole design on a more society-oriented base. So what does it mean for ideology, for instance? What does it say? And a classic example is a cross that shows a person we know as Jesus just having been crucified and died on it. So that would be the denotation if we see something like that. The connotation might be on a higher level, the ideology of Christianity that has obviously some relevance for some Western societies. Another important aspect to consider is that also the form and function of the object is of importance with the interpretation. And to just give you a very modern and plastic example, let's think of this a little person that we both see as water closets at doors and at traffic lights, and that on the surface seem to be the same picture but mean two completely different things. And this observation can of course be extended to archaeological materials. So if we have the same figure on a bridle or on a Viking Age boat, this might have different meanings because they are in different contexts. The next thing that could be handy to consider are just some usual art scientific terms that are not necessarily always correctly used by archaeologists. So I just give you a short run through. When I try to speak in art historian terms and describe a movement or an action in a picture, I usually talk about a narrative. A narrative can be movement, it can be walking, it can also be doing something to another picture or another pictorial element. Let's say someone who is gripping someone else's hand. I believe style might be a very intuitive term. So when you speak about style, we usually think about a way a picture is coded. A picture can be coded in a style that is naturalistic, like a photograph. It can be very stylized, like a comic or a manga. So that are different styles of representation. A symbol usually means something that stands in for something else. It can be a very representative picture, naturalistic, like let's say Jesus on the cross, and which is in a symbolic level standing for something else, or it can be something like this classic symbol of peace. The terms that you usually hear when we talk about Viking Age art is decor, which means pictorial representations on a surface. It's a quite neutral term, and so is the term motif, which just means a pictorial figure. Narrative I already explained to you, and symbol are usually two different things, even though archaeologists in their daily lingo tend to mix these things a little bit up, which can make it kind of confusing when you read the literature. And this transported us to the next question about what animal art means in a Viking Age context, and as you may have guessed, this is not what we see in front of us right now, even though these things also might fall under the larger umbrella of animal art. In an archaeological sense, animal art means a variety of decor that is prevalent between the Elder Germanic Iron Age, or also called the Migration period, until the early medieval times, which is post-Viking Age. So in front of us we see a gold bracelet, which is a kind of amulet showing Tyr, the god Tyr probably, that is bitten in the hand by the Fenris. In the middle we see some kind of clasp from what could be the younger Germanic Iron Age when we are in Denmark, also known as Merovingian period on the continent, and the Vendel period in Sweden. Vendel is a fine place where they have found important artifacts belonging to this period. And to the right you see a circular brooch that supposedly is found on or in the island of Gotland, and that stands in for everything Viking Age, which we will see in a little while. Before that, I will start with some other materials from the boat grave of Oseberg, which you hopefully know by now from our literature. And this is a wood carving from a wagon. A general problem with not only archaeologists but art historians in general has been, at least for a long time, the problem that we have been regarding or looking at these ancient arts with Western eyes, that have been very much calibrated by this an important phase of Western art history called the Renaissance. This happens to be the phase where many of the categories that we are still familiar with in our modern art have been decided on, so to speak. So this gives some problems when we meet traditions that do not necessarily follow our conventions on how to, even though this problem is a little more in the past than other things I have been talking about. So here we have it. blind respect for other traditions than Western, a lack of understanding of handicraft, and an inconsistent terminology and art concepts have made it kind of difficult to penetrate to the true function and meaning of animal art in the sense as it is understood today by me and many others in the field. So to start with, we have this wagon from the Oseberg burial. It is a panel with wood carving and shows and features pictures that are used in a way that does not totally conform with our division between a narrative and decor or mere ornament. If you start with the little part in the middle left, we see a probably female person as a person in female attire that is clasping the hand of a person in male attire holding a knife. So the big question is, of course, what's going on here? Is she trying to prevent him from using the knife to some other person in this picture? Or could it be that she has been putting the knife into his hand? That's an open question that is still out for debate. Another example for a narrative where someone is doing something or is moving, that would be the person a little bit more to the left who is riding a horse. And riding indicates some kind of movement and direction. This is something that falls or aligns very well with our modern concept of a narrative in visual art. Yet there is more to this little panel than you might think initially, because it also has a kind of peculiar floating into another category of visual art, which we in Western culture would read as ornament or decor. And what is characteristic for decor in our modern tradition? Let's just think about wallpaper, a repetitive pattern. In this case, a gathering of beasts that more or less had the same, that are arranged in similar body position and just forming a chain that seems to be going on and on until infinity, doesn't it? So this would very much correspond to our idea of, let's say, why not a nice wallpaper pattern? And yet, on the other hand, these beasts are doing stuff that fall more into line with a pictorial narrative. They are biting each other and they are gripping each other's limbs. So there is also a component of narrative in this decor. And this is just meant as a little eye-opener to show you that Viking Age art might be a different kettle of fish when we try to analyze it with method and concepts that have been developed first and foremost for Western art. And this led us on to the famous crane exercise, designed definitely not by me but someone else at Lund University, and which led to that we found a winner, a team of winners called Team Freya, who took 12 points by deciphering different animals from scratch. The next part of the lecture is about the history of animal art and how it developed, because for archaeology it has been a long time very relevant to have means to date different objects. So you wanted to know whether they were relatively early or late in the development, and one of the developments that people believed of significance and which are also in real life of significance is the development of art styles. Just think about how things are done in Western art history again. We have the Renaissance, followed by Mannerism and Baroque. The Baroque style is followed by Rococo. Then we have Classicism, and then all the retro styles like Gothic and others kick in. So, from this perspective, it made very much sense to also find styles in Nordic animal art that could be used in order to tell apart different periods. And the practical implication for this, of course, is imagine you open a grave and find metal artifacts that are in a certain animal style. which we can date, and so you are able to tell this thing is produced in the 730s, and since this product with animal art produced in the 730s has been buried and has some kind of wear and tear, we can say it must have been a few years after 730 this grave has been dug. So pretty straightforward, isn't it? Another case that or scenario that might be interesting for archaeologists is a pattern that is very much at home at one locality or one region and then suddenly re-emerging someplace else, and be it as an object that we know from the other place or in a totally new context. And this in turn might give us a clue that ideas or people have been moving from one place to another, and also perhaps been integrated into the local contexts. So, in archaeological terms, we would speak about cultural diffusion. So, to start at the very beginning, we need to acknowledge the fact that Germanic speaking people had been giving up on representational traditions for quite a while. Representational in this case means that someone is taking a picture in order to represent a phenomenon out of the live world, like people or beasts or any other object, which is rendered in a mode that more or less corresponds to how we perceive the world around us with our eyes. But around the year 300, in the outskirts of the Roman Empire and also beyond in the so-called free parts of Germania, suddenly these kind of animals reappear, these beasts reappear, albeit in a more stylized kind of way that seems to cater Germanic tastes much more. So the invention of animal art in the Germanic speaking area, because there are also other forms of animal art in other cultures, which we will not be talking about. This is solely on the Germanic people who are supposedly the forebearers of the people we would later call Viking Age. But in the Germanic speaking areas around 300, a new style appears after a long, long time of radio silence in pictorial art. So there had been representations back in the Bronze Age, that's in between, in rough terms, it begins 2500, kicks off around 1200 BC, and then disappears, give or take, 500 BC. But in that period, we had a naturalistic or almost naturalistic attempts at representation of people and beasts and boats and sun wheels and so on. But then, for some reason, this tradition disappears. It goes underground. Either it's because it isn't used at materials that have been preserved, or the Germanic people, for some reason, the Germanic people just didn't uh, feel like doing it. Maybe it was taboo. We don't know. That it's just not part of their tradition. And then, with the contact with the Roman Empire, a pictorial tradition is re-implanted into the Germanic speaking world. In this context, we need to remind ourselves that the Mediterranean world also had a tradition, a strong tradition of having representations of people and animals and also more mystic beings on everyday gear like belt buckles and so on and so forth, but these were much more naturalistic, and the stuff we are about to see a little bit further up north. Of course, that is now as a great secret that Germanic people and Roman people and people who didn't have Roman citizenship but were living in the wide vasts of the empire, of course, had continuous contact, even though there was the so-called Limes Wall. But we have not to think about the Limes Wall as a kind of Berlin Wall, but more it was not about stopping people entirely, it was just to control the movement of people a little bit better. And Germanic speaking people, of course, moved and lived in the Roman Empire. We have soldiers who have been living their period of um, paid army service in the Roman army, who are then returning to the parts of Germania which by the Romans were called the Free Germania, Germania Libera. And there is, of course, not much doubt that it is the Mediterranean tradition that kicks off this new urge of producing pictures. The difference, though, happens to be that these Nordic representations are much more stylized and seem to cater a Germanic taste that even involves much more in the centuries to come. So, if we take into the next phase, which represents the time after the dissolution of the Roman Empire, at least the Western Roman Empire, we can see different presentations of four-legged beasts that have been evolving much more into different phases of stylization. And I will not go too much into this because this is, of course, centuries before the Viking Age, is just in order to give you a background. So, what is significant for this kind of style is a kind of segmentation. So, beasts are segmented into different parts, which in turn get different kinds of small ornaments that just are imbuing these different segments. And when an animal has been or a beast has been construed, it will then be packed together with other beasts and the occasional human being into very dense clusters. This tradition of beasts clustered compactly on different surfaces, and we are still talking about the surface style, is sometime broken by the end of the migration period, meaning that we are approaching the date 550, and here a new kind of aesthetics are introduced from some, maybe deriving from some place totally far away like Egypt, and this ribbon style is translated into a new animal style where the body of the beast is not anymore built up by different segments, but rather by a string of ribbons where certain parts represent the body, other the lower and the higher limbs, and often combined with hats that initially reminded very much on what we saw in this older style, which is traditionally called Style 1. And yes, and this in turn develops a life of its own. So, in the subsequent era, which on the continent is called the Merovingian era, thanks to the dynasty that was ruling over France, at least nominally ruling, in Denmark, they usually speak about the late Germanic Iron Age, whereas the Swedes will speak about the Wendel period. And Wendel because some really important finds with this kind of animal style had been found nearby the church of Wendel in Uppland. Period is lasting approximately between 550 AD and 750 when the Viking Age begins. And as you will see by looking on these pictures, there is also a development going on in this style, so we can divide in between early and late styles based on different diagnostic features, which I will shortly mention. But let's instead go to the end of the Wendel Age and then take a jump into what we traditionally call the Viking Age, and which here in southern Scandinavia starts around 750, give or take a few years. We observe in the beginning of the Viking Age is a continuation in style in the sense that many beasts are constructed according to this ribbon principle of patterning, albeit in a much more stylized sense, because if you try to identify certain body parts, it's almost impossible to distinguish them if your eyes aren't trained to do that. So sometimes this really looks to me like a strange kind of pasta. So we go from spaghetti into a totally new variety of pasta. And I think sometimes I believe Italians might have an easy task in distinguishing these different kinds of beasts and styles just because they already have it in their cuisine. But just a bad joke here, sorry. So, in order to give you the opportunity to make the fullest of this lecture, I would like to propose that you now take the handout and just try to cross-check between the screen and the information in this handout on the first page, which gives you a Telegram style abbreviated description to recognize. So starting with the beasts at the latter half of the screen, we see as a general rule beasts with that are pasta shaped, spaghetti shaped, ribbon shaped, with a double outline and to a degree of really extreme abstraction. Body fillers are various. Uh, in regards to the curves, so we speak of curvature when we describe how things are bending. So the curvature tends to have a preference against for spaghetti type of bodies, ribbon style. Ears are usually abstracted or entirely missing. Eyes are usually round or missing. Very hard to give any rule on how heads are made. They come in so many different shapes. uh, and the limbs of the beast are frequently emerging from knots or from loop chains and are extremely elongated, tendril-like, and claws and wings of beasts have a tendency to remind us of the shape of the letter E in the alphabet. A large E, if that makes sense to anyone. The perspective of this representation is usually dominated by a profile view. We see the beasts in profile and the size relations in between the beasts in the compositions. There's a preference to them being balanced, so they are often of equal size in relationship to each other. The interesting part here is that this first style of what we call the Viking Age is not just about ribbon-shaped beasts. A type of newcomer that is emerging are four-legged beasts that have been associated with representation of lions, which people have been tracking to West European or continental European traditions, as you will see in the middle of the screen. But then at the extreme left in the middle, there is also a new type of beast that nobody could place in any known tradition outside of Scandinavia, or for that matter, into a tradition predating the Viking Age, and that is the so-called gripping beast. So gripping beasts are usually seen from a totally different perspective as the other kinds of beasts I've just been describing. So it is a perspective that combines an upper view, a bird's eye view, and a frog view, or we can also speak from as seen from below, and they usually have round heads, and they are called gripping beasts because they have paws that are gripping everywhere, sometimes into the frame of an object, sometimes these beasts are gripping at each other or themselves. The interesting part with these earliest Viking Age style is also that it comes in different media, such as metal to the left, but also in wood carving. And interestingly enough, here the medium and also the chests, or the habitus of the producers, results in slight stylistic differences. So if you look down there, we have small gripping beasts combined with a ribbon-shaped beast, and you can see they're a little bit more rounder, aren't they? On the other hand, there are also gripping beasts from the same period as the one seen above, and all these carving come again from the Oseberg burial, and this gripping beast is almost human-like, anthropomorphic. It has as a beard, and also the legs of the beast. The lower legs look almost like we imagine Viking age trousers. So there's a weird thing going on of beasts that are kind of almost human-like, but not always and not quite in every respect. Another Viking age novelty at the emergence of three-dimensional compositions in the archaeological record, and we need to remind ourselves it could be just that they already had three-dimensional compositions predating the Viking Age, but we don't see it, maybe because it perished. On the other hand, it might also be possible that the tradition didn't demand for three-dimensionality. Three-dimensionality is, however, a concept that gets hold of the Viking Age imagination, and we can see that reflected in the metal art, where metal casters, step by step, so to speak, move into the third dimension and develop their casting technique to create ever more exciting three-dimensional casts. One really beautiful example for such a cast comes from today's Russia, nearby the town of Yelets. One found a large equal armed brooch from the late 900s, and to just give you an impression, I will show you a little 3D model. So what you see is an object that originally, I have 3D scanned the original in Russia, in St. Petersburg. It would have been reconstructed around 330 gram of silver, which is a rather heavy object and very impractical for wear. On the other hand, it is a perfect conversation piece that almost demands of the wearer to take it off at some occasion and to show it around. Entering the Middle Viking Age, which we define for the period in between 850 and the year 1000, given or taken a few years, we can still distinguish a little menagerie of different beasts. So the first ones would be gripping beasts. Remember those little weird beings that are sometimes a little bit human-like, anthropomorphic, and that tend to grip in every direction. And in this specific date, they tend to have a pretzel-shaped body. There is a preference for circular ears. The eyes tend to be round. The beasts tend to have like cute little blunt snouts. The limbs of the beasts usually or quite often consist of spiral loops, and they often have forelegs. Other elements which are interested to consider is a tendency towards a small scale kind of symmetry. So beasts are usually a little more round and and in terms of perspective, we usually see them in a frontal view. So they look at us. Another feature that is kind of typical for this period are ring chains, and you will see the pictures of those in the handout. Another type of beasts in the menagerie are ribbon-shaped beasts, which have a continuity back to the spaghetti ribbon kind of pasta beasts, with the difference that these beasts here have a tendency to be much more compact. The body of the beast has usually an S-shaped, and the outlines of this body part are double-lined. Sometimes we also find some little markings on the inside of the body, for instance small dots or parallel rows. Then these beasts tend to have a neck tendril, something that some scholars have been interpreting as hairstyles, which is kind of odd with a beast, isn't it? In contrast to the previous ribbon-shaped beast, these have much more compact and short limbs. And in contrast to the simultaneous gripping beast, we often find only two legs represented, one in the front and one in the back. So the beast is usually shown in a profile view, and there's a tendency towards a certain imbalance in between beasts as soon as we find more than just one beast in the composition. Another beast in the menagerie of the mid-Viking age are birds, as seen to the right from the axe of Mammon. So these birds initially fall kind of very much in line with the compact ideal, but as we can see to the right, there is again a kind of tendency of splitting up certain body parts. So if you look at the wings of the bird, you realize that the feathers of the wings are pointing in every possible direction and looping around, and that might have also a component that will be interesting for dating. And this takes us to the last part of the Viking Age and the beginning of the medieval era. At the beginning, the menagerie is quite the same as before in the Middle Viking Age, with one big exception, and that is the disappearance of the gripping beast. For some mysterious reason, they just fall out of favor, and one might speculate that they represent something that is not permissible anymore. A tendency that we already have observed earlier, but that is now taken to the extreme, is the splitting up of several body parts again. So if we look at what is supposedly the main of this carnivore, it could be a lion, is are these organic looking sprouts, almost vegetable, that seem to emerge from, in this case, the mane, but also the tail of the, let's say, lion in this case, and it gives you like a feeling almost like asparagus, or if you are a fan of the HBO series The Last of Us, let's speak about cordyceps that is just emerging from the bodies of these beasts. The heads of the beasts are usually a bit more on the smaller size compared with comparable beasts in the Middle Viking Age, and eyes sometimes are almond shaped instead of circular. The limbs of the beasts are usually adorned with spiral loops that weren't that frequent in Middle Viking Age, and occasionally also a bit more elongated. Beasts frequently come along on four or two legs, and so it might be just because they are presented in different postures and different perspectives, rather than have them being really two-legged instead of four-legged. If we look at the grander scheme of things, there's a tendency of imbalance if more than one beast is presented on the canvas. So there is, so to speak, this organic feel in the form of these tendrils that are sprouting, and there is a little bit more of imbalance and elongation going on, and the spirals on the legs also indicate occasionally something that is more advanced and go into the 1000s. This tendency of elongating stuff is taken to the absolute extreme, but just about one generation later, when you see that everything is just elongated to the extreme, we are basically back to the spaghetti style of things. Bodies are extreme elongated. The heads of the beasts usually feature almond-shaped eyes that also grow to the extreme. As to legs, they have sometimes still spiral loops. They can be missing occasionally in a very illogical way, so that meaning that we might meet a beast that happens to have three legs, not two, not four, but three. It is a very elegant and refined style that has been the role model for everything elvish when you look at least at Peter Jackson's version of Middle Earth, for instance, in Lord of the Rings. However, the source of these new phase of elegant beasts is not to be found among the elvish people, as you might think, but there is another interesting theory on what has been going on here, and that might be a retro style. So the epicenters for this new style emerging in the archaeological record are southern Scandinavia, that is Denmark, for instance, as cast brooches and badges, which not really work as brooches because they are so delicate. Uh, and that have been cast in different urban contexts like Lund, and there's Ribe, for instance. There's also the city of Aalborg in northern Jutland, Denmark. But the other epicenter is, of course, Uppland, where we have seen many, many rune stones that are decorated with ribbon shaped beasts. And for that very region, we also have an interesting theory why that have come about, that founds on the idea of people expressing their dissatisfaction with the new political state of things, with the church dominating the economics. As you may recall, according to the Nordic tradition, landholding was, of course, stewarded by one male heir, but the land in itself always fell back into the hands of the family. It was not a personal property, people only landed it. So if someone was giving land to a tenant farmer, let's say, this land was supposed to return into the hands of the family after a certain amount of years. On the other hand, the Nordic people also had become good Christians, and one of the paramount of good Christian behavior is to do good deeds, aka donating things and land and holdings and titles to the church. The problem emerged when the Nordic families, after an amount of years, wanted to have this land returned according to their custom, but realized that the church had a totally different view on ownership, claiming that according to the Latin law it was theirs from henceforth. And that might have triggered a kind of sentiment of resistance where people went back to the past, in that case, maybe artifacts that were still stored in treasure chests from the previous centuries, or maybe even in graves that were dug up again, in accordance with this traditional idea of graves being occupied by grave dwellers that were hanging around a certain amount of years and then transition to another place, the afterlife, so that they weren't in need anymore of having this object for personal use. So it would have been very proper to get them back and to restore them to the families. This in turn would be another sign of being Viking Age people being people who really had a concept of the past, and to also saw material culture as a way of anchoring themselves into this family stories, because you remember rune stones are often to be found nearby local grave fields that in turn symbolized the symbiosis of a family clan with the land that they held. To return to the end of the tale, at least in respect to animal art in Scandinavia, it fizzles out in the early medieval years or high medieval, because in Scandinavia, with a really long Iron Age that concludes with the Viking Age, you make just a jump into the High Middle Ages. We believe that this style of elongated and retro looking kind of beasts was produced until about 1200, when it then gradually merged with the Central European Romanesque tradition of art, as you can see at your right hand. And this is a beautiful example how foreign elements are integrated and merged with traditional pictorial language. So here we have it, the development of animal art from the migration period or pre-migration period until the early medieval time in a nutshell. The next part of the lecture deals with the questions how different generations of researchers have been approaching the phenomenon of animal art in the course of time. The scholarly saga of dealing with animal art starts in a time when archaeology was not even a science yet. We had this antiquarian movement that was very much about finding one's national roots and preserving old and interesting phenomena. That also is part of the reasons why scholars, mostly in Denmark, but also traveling up north to Iceland and so on, were gathering manuscripts and starting reading about ancient gods and heroes and other things. So, in a sense, there has been always a tradition and an ability to connect pictures, especially on rune stones and picture stones, with these ancient tales in some sense. And that also prevailed in the infancy of archaeology, where people had the most fantastic associations. The 19th century, an age of exploration and of invention and of new scientific endeavors, archaeology was, of course, also impacted by the strive to become a real science. One of the theoretical paradigms, and now we talk again about theory, these goggles that scholars take on, a very prevalent paradigm back in the mid 19th century, and we are talking post Darwin's book on the origin of species, was evolutionism. Speak about a time where the intellectuals are taken, absolutely taken by the idea of evolution and the idea that life forms, that's like one kind of beast, over time and under the mechanisms of natural selection evolves into a new species. And this idea of a forward movement trickled down in society and also into archaeology, but also transformed in certain respects. So it became also associated with a kind of deterministic idea of how life forms evolve and disappear. So the idea here was that every kind of evolution, that also could be cultural evolution, would start with a kind of silent blooming up that then would come up to its zenith and then just disintegrate into something that would eventually die off and be replaced by a new blooming flower. So this was the time of Sophus Müller, a really great Danish archaeologist and scholar who did much good to archaeology, but in regard to animal art also set stop for mythological interpretations for almost a century by writing a scathing review of elder research. He just put it to total ridicule. Let's put it like this. And instead demanding of archaeologists, instead of focusing on interpreting or associating those pictures with myths, instead to concentrate on archaeologically relevant questions like how to date stuff and how to see whether these materials mirror the transfer of ideas from one place to another. This, of course, meant total death for kind of accepted ideas, like if we look at this picture stone from Hunnestad that today is to be found in Lund. Here we see a person with snakes in her hand riding a wolf, and this representation seems to fit rather well with a description in the Eddas on Baldur's death, where Baldur, the god Baldur, is to be burnt doing a ritual cremation, and a giantess and a dwarf are appearing at the funeral to pay their respects, and the gods, being very Viking-like as we do now, and do not being nice to outgroup representatives, just sacrifice these two people, that is, the dwarf and the giantess Hurricane, who came riding on a wolf. So, in that sense, it is a picture that fits rather nicely to the description in the Eddas. Another example we see on our right, which is a person with a hammer sitting in a boat and drawing with something that looks to be a bovine head, as just fishing for a great ribbon-shaped beast. And this fits rather well with the adjective description about Thor, the god Thor, going on a fishing trip that ended with him almost killing the Midgard serpent because Thor was fishing with an oxen head, and instead of a great whale or other kind of what Vikings would have considered a fish. We know it's a mammal, but anyway, um, this Midgard serpent just hooked, and he tried to draw it into the boat and draw as hard as possible until his foot went through the planks of the boat. And this is exactly what we see on this runestone monument from Altuna in Middle Sweden, don't we? Nonetheless, all of these kind of interpretations in regard to animal art were cancelled by Sophus Müller, who would maybe accept some readings on monumentals, like let's say the Hunnestad stone, but on the other hand would not permit utilitarian objects like brooches and other stuff to have that same significance, because he was an adherent of a very up-to-date theory according to which ornament producing societies like the ones like the Vikings did not have yet matured enough intellectually and evolutionary to be able to associate decor with content. That's a thought, isn't it? But it reflects very much what people also were thinking and believing about other cultures that they had encountered during their colonial projects all over the world. So, which in turn teaches us that there's always some politics involved in a science. We can't escape it as human beings, I'm afraid. Anyway, the new project that had been inaugurated by Sophus-Müller took really hold of the new imagination of the Archaeological Society, and one of the representatives who implemented it quite thoroughly was a Swede called Bernhard Salin. Salin developed a very interesting and totally scientific method of splitting up, in that case, the ribbon-shaped beasts of the Merovingian or Vendel Age, and also the earliest Viking Age, which people back then still believed to be part of the Vendel Age continuum of art, into different segments to then order these in lines of development, and by the combination of different parts that represented different stages of development to decide and to score which beasts were earlier and which were younger in a chronological sense. And this was the beginning of a 80-year-long saga of animal style research. This meant that there were generations to follow in different countries all over Europe who started dividing their local styles into different subgroups in order to gain parameters that would allow them to date and to follow the diffusion of different cultural patterns. This proved to be a very successful recipe, and many careers have been founded on the principle of just subdividing existing styles into an ever more increasing number of substyles. It started all with Bernhard Salin, who made a very basic subdivision of a style conglomerate that starts during the migration period, spans over the Merovingian period or the Vendel period, and ends at the very beginning of the Viking Age as we know today, and subdividing it into three style groups. Style 1 consists of these very compact beasts that have been subdivided in different parts and tend to be clustered into dense patterns. Style 2 consists mostly of beasts that have been constructed according to the ribbon principle, where different parts of the beasts are constructed as interlacing ribbons, and it spans the very last part of the migration period we do know today until the end of the Merovingian period or Vendel period as it is known in Scandinavia, so around 750. The last style is known as style 3 and consists of the pasta shaped beasts that are totally disintegrating and that we have been looking thoroughly on earlier today. These beasts we do know today are actually dating through the very beginning of the Viking Age. During the following decades, then subsequent scholars made a career by subdividing these established styles into new subgroups. So, two of the most important were a power couple from Uppsala that later on fell apart during a dig at Valsgärde. And they subdivided Saline's style too into 5 phases. They called the Wendel styles, and that's because there was this important find site in Sweden at that consisted of pre-Viking Age boat graves that had been detected nearby Vendel in the region of Uppland north of Stockholm, and that provided a plenitude of beautiful metal objects that feature different phases of this style. Later on, other scholars realized that Vendel style A does not really exist as claimed by Arvidsson and Olsen, and it has disappeared from the record, so to speak. On the plus side, we can grant Greta Arvidsson and Per Olsen that they followed the principles that had been established by Bernhard Salin, which just means that they focus solely on style by putting apart the beasts into their different body parts, that is heads and bodies and lower legs and upper legs and so on, and to look at how these parts developed and that by this estimate their relative date. Unfortunately, not everyone in Viking Age research has been as methodologically consequent, and so we come to our next slide featuring two gentlemen who during a long time have been put on a pedestal for within Viking Age research for subdividing the Middle Age Viking styles into even more subgroups, which they called Boros style, Yelling style, Mammon style, Ringerike style, and Erne style. And these names derive from different spots where these styles had been observed. So in case of the Boros style, we are speaking about the grave mound in Norway. In case of the Yelling style, we're speaking about the royal site of Yelling in Jutland, that you hopefully have been reading about by now. The Mammon style has got its name from a find site at Mammon, also in Jutland, a famous grave mound. The Ringerike style, on the other hand, is named after a picture stone, rune stone, in the area of Ringerike in Norway. So it is a whole area that is standing in here for a name. And the Erne style, of course, is named after a famous stave church in the fjords of Norway. In order to understand my slight critique on why these styles might not be as well established as the other ones, one needs to know that they are based on a different ordering principle than the earlier subdivisions of Germanic animal style done by Salin and by Greta Arvidsson and Per Olsen, as well as some other researchers I haven't been mentioning here, which was an ordering principle I'm calling element based. So number one is element based, as you can see on the slide, and I invite you to cross-check here with the compendium. The definition system propagated by Wilson and Clint Jensen, on the other hand, is much more chaotic, and according to my notion, it does not really follow one stringent line of thought. So instead of just following what we would perceive as style in a Salinic sense, they combined these detailed observations with other features. That is the existence of different motives or the absence of some motives in different style phases. So what they are basically doing is mixing up two different categories of pictorial functions that just do not blend well if you just think a little bit more analytically. So, as you will see when looking into the handouts, you will realize that they suddenly start to define the Boris style, not only according to the question how the details of the beasts are formed, but also by the presence of a certain motive that is the gripping beast, and which, according to Wilson and Clint Jensen, happens to be the main feature that divides it from the subsequent yelling style. It is dominated by beasts which are seen in profile, whereas the boar beast is usually seen en face, even though there are also some other perspectives in this style. And again, I ask you to just cross check the descriptions in the compendium I have prepared for you. Next, we have the Mammon style, that according to Clint Jensen and Wilson consists of certain style traces, but also the presence of the so-called great beast. And I'm talking about this four-legged beast that some people interpret as representation of a lion. And according to Wilson and Clint Jensen, the Borer, Yelling and Mammon style cover the entirety of the Middle Viking Age. The beginning of the Late Viking Age would then be marked by the Ringerike style, that is a conglomerate of stylistic traces. We have earlier, for instance, been talking about those sprouts that are emerging from the beasts and that have almost some kind of organic, vegetably, or why not cordyceps-like appearance, as well as other traces that you can see in the handout, but combined with the presence of diagnostic beasts like this great beast, for instance, and others, as well as the absence of the gripping beasts that has been cancelled from the menagerie of Nordic beasts. And the final style, which I will come back to later on, would be the Ernest style, which is this most elegant retro style that is based on older style 2 ribbon-shaped beasts. It has really caught on the public imagination and is seen every time someone is speaking about Viking Age art, including my course that is featuring it on the front page if you have been looking on Canvas. So we have it in a nutshell again, the different styles, all from the Roman Iron Age through the Migration period, the Vendel period, the Viking period, which is the last phase of the Nordic Iron Age, and then finishing during the High Medieval era that follows, at least here in the northern latitudes of Europe. And if you look down, you see again a shorthand for the different ordering principles that have been applied to establish this chronological framework. The whole system of style dating has also been heavily criticized, and one scholar I would like to emphasize here is my former mentor, Leonard Carlson, who unfortunately isn't living anymore, and he wrote a really great book back in the 1980s that will also appear on your list for voluntary reading because it's mainly in Swedish, even though there's a great English summary at the end of it. And what Leonard did, being an art historian who did not fear for his career in archaeology, was just throwing a hand grenade into this meticulously building that generations of archaeologists been creating and that nobody dared to question, as of course it also provided food and shelter and opportunities for people who intended to make a career by subdividing established styles into even more sub-styles. So I leave you with some quotes from Leonard to just Peru, and at the same, I just need to tell you that Leonard naturally didn't remain the only person in the entirety of academia to criticize certain atrocities that we as archaeologists have committed when it comes to analyzing Nordic animal art. The work of Clint Jensen and Wilson has been criticized for good reasons, especially when it comes to the styles which are Bore, Yelling and Ringerike and that are associated with the Middle Viking Age, that is approximately between 850 and the year 1000. One of the problems that have been pinpointed several times is the occurrence of many blends of styles that are supposed to be different ones, especially when it comes to high quality artifacts that feature more complex compositions than the original artifacts that have been name giving for the different style groups. And as an example, I show here a ring ping from Romerike in Norway. And as you can see, we have beasts that are seen in profile and that more or less correspond stylistically to the yelling style, and then combined with beasts seen in front, and these are usually associated with the Boris style. And some scholars just have been speaking about a sub-style that is a conglomerate between Bore and yelling style. Interestingly enough, uh, these beasts are sitting on the horns of some kind of headgear that is resting over a human face. I believe this is one of the instances that might induce a question whether there was a concept of horn hammers or something in the Viking Age, even though we do not know whether these only existed in the sphere of visual art or whether they also had real life counterparts. Anyway, the problem of mixing styles had inducing other scholars to question the entire project of subdividing the mid-Viking Age styles into three different entities. But one of these persons is Ingmar Jansson, who, by the way, also is acquainted with me, he being my former PhD supervisor. And so I'm a bit partial here, I'm afraid. But what Ingmar did was suggesting that since we do not really have any indications of these three styles, that is Bora, Yelling, and Mammon style, being clearly distinguishable in terms of chronology or geography or even the social spheres where they were used, why not just throwing them together into one single style that I suggest we could call just mid-Viking Age style, and that covers the period in between 850 and 1000. These are only my personal musings that coincidentally also align with my former mentors and living mentors. And if you look into the handout I have been providing you, you will get all the possibilities to upkeep this style division that Clint Jensen and Wilson have been propagating and are still propagating, because I think David Wilson is still alive. And this leads me back to the final phase of the Viking Age represented by the Ringerike style and the subsequent Urne style that is heavy influenced by the earlier Vendel Age styles that date in between 550 and 750, and maybe also the early Viking Age style. It has been called style number 3 by Bernhard Selin, or that also could be called style E if we take the system of Greta Arvidsson and Per Olsen, and so on and so forth. Interesting enough, the Urne style has been subject of a study by Professor Anne-Sophie Gräslund of Uppsala University. And what Anne-Sophie did was subdividing the patterns on rune stones into different subgroups using a strictly Salinic principle. And the outcome have been 5 groups, one of which belongs into the Ringerike style, and a subdivision of the Urne style on the other hand into 4 subgroups. And the good news in that respect is, since Anne-Sophie has been working with runestones, amongst others the one that we have met already earlier in a previous lecture on the Bruby stones, we actually can date them. So we can tell apart earlier and different because we do know the family genealogy of the Bruby family clan, including Astrid and her grandson Jarlabanki, which is really good news because in certain aspects it seems the Salinic method, that is not mixing up style and motives but solely concentrates on different body elements and how they develop, has scientific value after all. and now to something completely different. Whereas I have been speaking about the subdivision of animal styles just for the sake of chronology and geographic patterns and the movement of ideas and people, I've been totally sidelining the question about the meaning of animal art. Of course, two reasons. We had this prevailing fear established by Sophus Müller back in the 1880s that had been domineering for almost a century. But there have been some heroes, and one of these heroes who dared to try to connect animal art with meaning. That was a German scholar called Karl Hauck. Of course, you are much welcome to take this claim and with a pinch of salt, as we do know how science works, which is a dialogue of people, and some voices will be heard, whether others will be ignored. So the accomplishment of Karl Hauck was to show that the bracteates, which we have been talking about earlier, that is a kind of amulet from the migration period, seems to feature several mythological themes that we recognize from the much later written record from Iceland and the northwest of Scandinavia is the Eddas, and that is Snorri's book on poetry. It had been codified 700 years later on Christian parchment. So, just to order to explain what you have in front of you right now, this is a bracteate from the migration period. It features a human-like figure that places one hand into the mouth of something that really looks like a dog or a wolf. And this, of course, takes us to the Attic tale or myth about how the Fenris was put into chains by the gods. This new line of thinking opened in turn up for many new interpretations, and to just give you a potpourri of different pictures from different parts of the long history of Nordic animal arts is an idea that needs to be researched on, of course, considering the time that has been laid down by the people who have been producing that. Why should they not have been associating certain animal art with something more than only a sense of stylishness, if you know what I mean? So, for instance, let's look up to the right and look at something, a rune carving from a big mountain at Ramsunda in middle Sweden that seems to mirror the heroic saga of Sigurd, the dragon slayer. Sigurd the dragon slayer is also featured at a Romanesque position with a certain Nordic elements, where we can see him sticking his sword into the dragon. A somewhat earlier example from the Middle Viking Age would be the master smith Wayland escaping his prison by constructing a flying machine of his own design. And if we go furthest to the left, we will see a brooch from the migration period that is featuring a composition that absolutely looks narrative, doesn't it? Some person is swallowed by some ribbon-shaped beast. So what might be the story behind that one? I would say if you had been asking my 25-old me, that is like, oh goodness, 23 years ago, I would have been so certain about the answer, because I was just learning Old Nordic and would have gone through all the Edda and tried to find a passage that would fit a description, someone being swallowed by a beast, and just stick to it without giving much thought to the fact that there are 700 years or so between the date when the brooch was produced and the date when the Attic tradition has been written down on Christian parchment, not minding the possibility of transformation and change in these myths. Today, however, I'm much more systematic with this kind of things, and I would like to take this opportunity to demonstrate how I a few years ago, in line of my PhD project, developed a method that helps us to decipher the meaning of animal art, at least in one very well-defined context. I have summarized part of the method in a short article that is on our mandatory reading, and if you wish, you can also read my dissertation, even though that is mostly in Swedish. There's also a short summary in English that will give you an idea of the general scope of my form of work. I've been speaking about how the mandate of Sophus Müller back in the 1880s led to that animal art was not associated with mythological themes as had been before during the 1800s and previously. However, our materials are of course also used outside the narrow scope of archaeology, but there have been, for instance, philologists who made tries to associate the structure and the aesthetics of animal art to skaldic poetry. So just to a short recap from our second installment of the arts and crafts on poetry, you will recall that we have two main branches of poetry that has been preserved on medieval parchment, which is skaldic poetry and Eddic poetry, and they have certain differences. Skaldic poetry is usually occasional. We have known authors and a very complex meter, whereas Eddic poetry is more or less timeless. It is anonymous because it's not the authorship that is the most important part, but the transport of a cultural memory and rather simple meters. And this has led to the notion that Eddic poetry can be heavily influenced by latter agendas, whereas skaldic poetry is not easy to falsify, and therefore skaldic poetry is often used in order to quality check the authenticity of the information on mythology given by the Eddic poems. So what makes the skaldic poetry so durable is a combination of thoroughly measured syllables, a very difficult meter, and the art of paraphrasing, which in turn falls into two branches. First, we have Haiti, that is mythological motivated replacement names for different figures in mythology. In this case, Odin, who has a plenitude of names that allude to other myths. The other element in the art of paraphrasing was the use of canning. And as you recall, there is, for instance, this idea of circumscribing a ship as horse of the sea, which is a kind of schizophrenic picture in the sense that we combine two ideas from two conceptually different spheres like land and sea and mold a new kind of picture out of it. And this creates a semantic conflict in our minds, which contributes to that these pictures just stick to memory. A phenomenon that must be mentioned, though, is the fact that cognitive studies show that this transfer of one picture onto another, in that case the horse that is running the wind-swept plains of Iceland onto the boat that is crossing the ocean, that these transfers are not stable. So our minds are not built to merge this into one, but it is rather about two competing pictures where our mind is oscillating back and forward between two alternative readings of one and the same text. I wish you to remember this for later because we will also observe something similar within the Viking Age animal art. Before that, we need still to explore the art of poetry. The interesting thing is that the canning horse of the seas for boat is not just one single phenomenon, but it rather is part of a larger cluster consisting of cannings that transfer or that evoke first the picture of a land-bound beast and then transfer it onto the realm of the seas. To give you one example from this cluster, one could liken a boat to a bear, but in order to make it extra hard to understand it for people who were considered outsiders, we would describe the bear with a replacement word, Haiti, in that case, the overwinterer or the winter sleeper. And this, of course, alludes to the fact that bears tend to hibernate through winter. And by calling the bear not a bear of the sea, but overwinterer of the brook, it gets even more difficult for people who are not really initiated into skaldic art to guess the meaning of what is being said. On the other hand, if you belong to the exclusive club who has been familiarized with the idea to describe boats by moving land-bound beasts into the spheres of the waters, then you will be able to decipher this riddle quite easily. Nonetheless, as I indicated before, the art of creating cannings is not only about creating crossword puzzles. It's also very much about transferring certain properties from one place to another. So projecting certain qualities of the bear onto the boat. First and foremost, we might imagine the strength of the bear, or the fierceness of the bear, or maybe also the movement of the bear, but there is more to it, indicated by the name Winter Sleeper, because, as you know, not do only bears hibernate through winter season, but boats are also sleeping through winter season, as the Viking Age people tended to store their boats on dry land till the warm spring sun was melting the ices and the boat was once again launched into the water like a bear that is leaving hibernation and crossing a brook. So, in conclusion, by taking a phenomenon off the land and transplanting it onto the realm of the sea, which on a conceptual level represent two distinct spheres that do not mingle, interestingly enough, not only in the Viking mind, but also according to our modern westernized concepts, the Skalds succeeded in creating an important ingredient to a recipe that led to that oral information could be transmitted over generations in a very reliable way. And some of this information had also a mythological dimension, as we will see soon. So, in order to recapitulate on something that we have already been discussing before, I would like to draw your attention again to the classic canning of gold, which is Mardul's Tears. The word Mardul is a Haiti with some murky, unknown mythological connotation, and is a name for Freya, the goddess Freya. And as you may recapitulate, Freya was a fertility goddess that had been married to her brother Frey and been divorced by initiative of the Aesir, the ruling gods, which resulted in her shedding many tears. And since Freya is a goddess, those tears were of course not merely made of the usual salty liquid that mere mortals produce, but they were of sheer gold. So what you see in front of you is the different steps of deciphering this kind of canning. So in order to recapitulate, we remember that the durability of skaldic information rests on three pillars, which is measured syllables, a difficult meter, and the art of paraphrasing some words by using canninga and heitin, which is the Old Norse pluralis of canning and Haiti. I would like to say, to give you a materialization of those principles, we will be looking at the Karlavi runestone that features a praise poem for a fallen king, combining all those principles. As with a rune inscription, we always start with transliterating the text and then normalizing it by using words that are preserved in Old Norse texts from the medieval era. So here it is, first in Old Norse. Folken ligger hins fylk thu, Flester visti stat, miester. Dauðir dolga frúðar, draugris þeimsi haugi. Mun að vreið við ráða, róg starker í Danmörku. Endils jörmun grundar, örgrandari landi. Yes, and kindly excuse the modern Icelandic accent I'm contributing here with. It's hard to differentiate those two languages. Anyway, so what anybody attending a skaldic performance would try to do is to rearrange the different parts of this text in their minds and then to solve those different cannings in order to make sense and to get the core of the message. Interestingly enough, we have found some bones, animal bones, that have inscriptions of skaldic fragments. So maybe it was even in that sense that people attended a great festive occasion. All of their local chief listened in and segments of the poem in runes in order to decipher the cannings and make sense of it. Such a fragment of a runic poem we do find in Sigtuna, the Christian town of Sigtuna, and even, if I remember correctly, at Staraya Ladoga, which is east of St. Petersburg in Russia, and that was occupied back in the day by people of Nordic descent. With no further ado, let's rearrange the Karlovy inscription. Hidden in this mound lies the one whom followed the greatest deeds. Most people knew that, and now the first canning starts. A 3 of battle Thrud. Thrud is the name of a giantess, it's a canning. So you have to decipher it as a tree of the goddess of war. And the tree of a goddess of war is a person, as there is a canning model where men are described as trees. So let's start again. Hidden in this mound lies the one whom followed the greatest deeds. Most people knew that, a true warrior. Never again in the whole of Denmark will there be any other hard fighting. And now the next canning comes. Wagon wither upon Andil's expanses. Who is Wither and who is Andil? Wither is a Haiti for the god Odin, whereas Andil is the name of a sea giant. And this construction can be dissolved into the Odin of the sea giant's expanses, and an Odin of the sea giant's expanses is a seafaring king, or if you will, a pirate king. Again from the beginning. Hidden in this mounds lies the one whom followed the greatest deeds. Most people knew that, a true warrior. Never again in the whole of Denmark will there be any other hard-fighting seafaring king rule the land more honestly. So, as you may have understood by now, the art of a skald, of a true skald, is describing, praising some person, often of higher status, by taking different mental pictures that describe mythological beings and to transfer characteristics of these persons and beings that the skald is alluding to onto the person that is described. So by describing the dead pirate king, by alluding to probably a myth on Odin who had been fighting a sea giant, the quality of heroic warfare that is imbuing Odin is transferred to that deceased person. And now things are getting really weird, because skaldic poets and their listeners tended to regard a poem as an artwork that equaled a physical object. This is, of course, in line with the thinking of an oral cultures where words equal deeds. Scoles would describe themselves as wordsmiths, their poems as jewelry that had been created by wordsmithing. A skaldic poem would be traded into gifts. So you were giving a gift to someone, often a leader, by dedicating a poem to him. There could be also poems dedicated to women, but as you have read, hopefully, in the extra materials I sent you, then you had to really get the permission of her kin, otherwise things could end really horribly for this gold. But you could dedicate a poem to a leader and were expecting a gift in return. In conclusion, we are in the sphere of gift exchange, and there is a really interesting parallel to how we believe that fine smiths, metalsmiths, were treated in Nordic society. And this leads me much more into my former PhD project, where I was able to show that there are many parallels how metalsmiths and scolds were treated in Nordic society. So there are those contextual parallels, for instance, in the way how these products came about and also how they were perceived. Many of the metalsmiths needed a patron in order to do their art, in the same sense as a scold also needed a patron who would pay for the time that construing such a poem would take. Also, the sphere in which high class smithing was displayed would very much coincide with the sphere where skaldic poetry was used. For instance, in the halls of the chiefs. Another parallel is of compositional nature, and a third one is of pictorial nature, which I will explain henceforth. Let's start once again with the brooch from Jelets, which is probably originating from a Gotlandic handicraft tradition and then ate up in a part of the Viking world that today is in Russia. So this brooch is an absolute masterpiece of smithing. It is highly three-dimensional. Originally, before it broke up, it would have been 230 grams of silver, a really heavy piece that probably would have been part of a female gear. As we remember, these cast brooches were usually used in order to pin together some kind of shawl or cloak in the female dress. By the sheer merit of weight and also the merit of ornament, it would have been a conversational piece almost that was made and constructed in order to be taken off at a certain point at a festive occasion and to be shown around amongst the guests. Here we also have to remember the role of the high status female. You remember the Queen Welthro in the Beowulf, who is the key holder to the access to the king. So the idea of a female person carrying around this kind of conversation piece falls also well in line with our concept of female power strategies. Interesting enough, the Jelets brooch, as many other brooches from this handicraft tradition I've been speaking about, which is East Scandinavian, are littered with puzzle pictures. And what is a puzzle picture? A puzzle picture is a intricate real composition that contains two or more competing motifs. So in that case, just to give a modern example, we have the so-called Rubens vase that displays both a vase and two human faces seen in profile. And thanks to the fact that our brains are not capable of combining these into one monolithic reading, our perception is still that oscillating in between two alternatives, very much like with a canning, if you remember the description of the boat that is also a bear or a horse. Into the middle of things, let's look at a sculptural brooch from this East Scandinavian tradition and probably the same workshop, which displays a gripping beast from the Middle Viking Age that in an alternative reading also constitutes a large animal head. And this kind of reading is backed up by other similar compositions from the Middle Viking Age, which display similar mixes. If we turn around the same brooch, we will see another puzzle picture consisting of a male person, probably with a grand mustachio. And if we turn this composition upside down, it will suddenly transform into a bird. This pictorial composition happens to have parallels, in that case, from a pendant in Russia, from Gniezdovo, where we also see, amongst other things, a male head with a beard and a mustachio that can alternatively be read as a bird. In order to return to the parallels between the metalsmith and the skald, we have contextual parallels which concern the craft terminology. There is an idea of competing with oneself and other professionals. The social status and interactions between, for instance, member of the upper class would have been quite similar. Second parallel would be the compositional parallels as recently described with the puzzle pictures and the cannings. Total anti-naturalistic style of, because the feeling of the art is really so far from naturalism that some of you have been speaking about psychedelic aesthetics, if I recall it correctly. These crossword aesthetics that we have been seeing, and there's also, believe it or not, a semantic conflict in both art forms. So you, of course, recall the semantic conflict that a canning-like horse of the seas would create by combining two different spheres that are conceptual each other's opposites, so sea and land. And what I have been able to show in line of my PhD research was that these schizophrenic semantic conflicts also reappear in the pictorial evidence. So if we, for instance, look at this pendant from Gniezdovo, we able to make out three different semantic conflicts, providing that the bird is standing for the spheres of air, nature, and animal, and the human being for the spheres of land, culture, and humanity. Because according to the Age mind, the domains of air and land were their natural opposite, as would be nature and culture, and the animal kingdom versus the human realm. And that compositional parallel in between metalsmithing and skaldic poetry, there is also a pictorial parallel, as many of these combinations that we do see have parallels in skaldic poetry. For instance, if we again look at the person on the Gniezdovo pendant, it seems to represent a person that wears some kind of mask. We know from mythology as preserved in skaldic poetry that Odin could be described with the Haiti Grimnir, the masked one. And if we try to decipher the combination of a bird and a person with a mask, in the same sense as we would try to decipher a canning, we would start with this Haiti, Grimnir, the masked one, and describe the bird as the bird of Grimnir, or the bird of Odin, or, if we dissolve this pictorial canning entirely, of a raven. As you see, there is a possibility that puzzle pictures worked in the same way as skaldic poetry, also in a pictorial sense. So these three parallels I've been able to detect in between skaldic poetry and metal casting, that is contextual, compositional, and pictorial, leads up to the grand finale, trying to find an answer why these parallels do exist. One potential equation could have been that animal art served as a kind of pictorial writing system that was used in order to preserve skaldic poetry, very much in the same sense as hieroglyphs had been working in ancient Egypt. The problem though with this interpretation happens to be that I at least have not been able to track any grammatical system that is usually also part of a writing system, and that gives the reader a possibility to decide in which directions to read the text. And that's why I am not sure that we have enough evidence to speak about animal art as a writing system to preserve skaldic memory. An alternative interpretation that seems much more likely happens to be skaldic poetry and the animal art of these brooches working in the same context, let's say when being used at a festive occasion in order to create multimodal texts. And this whole hypothesis builds on the observation that many skaldic poems had been associated with a genre of poetry that is called ekphrases. Phrases is a phenomenon that is also found in the classic world and described as a poem that is describing an object, not necessarily an object that is existing, but painting a mental image of an object. So, for instance, a classic one would be the description of the shield of the hero Achilles in the Iliad by Homer, that at least in part dates back to the Bronze Age of the Aegean world, that is the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Let's transport ourselves to the Viking Age world. And let us imagine you are a visitor from abroad. We are in eastern Sweden, and you have come from all the way from Iceland, where you do not have much material goods, but you happen to know the art of poetry. And you have a plan because you want to become part of the retinue of this Jarl in order to make a career, to participate in all the riches that they have and that they acquire through warfare and so on and so forth. But you are lucky. You still know that you have family ties at a farm nearby, not necessarily a very large one, but something that is a little bit above genteel poverty. So your family back in East Sweden still belongs to a sphere that is occasionally invited to the hall of the Jarl at a festive occasion, and that's your chance. So you got your ticket into one of these occasions. Let's say it is these uploads. There's some offerings going on and so on and so forth, some religious rituals, and afterwards there is a big party. So you have been attending all of this. You are sitting at a bench in the hall, but still separated by degrees of separation from the Jarl, who's sitting high up in his high seat on the other side of the fireplace that separates you from the really important persons. There's no way for you to just approach this Jarl. You are lacking connections, but luckily there is a link, which is the lady of the house. One person who can bend the Jarl's ear, who has power to build connection and to draw you into his sphere. You have been observing her during the last days of the festival, whether she still was leading the cultic sacrifice of a ram to the Disir gods. But now at the final stage of the festival she is serving in another role, which is being the lady of the house who is serving food and drinks to the guests in the hall. And so the lady of the house will descend from her natural position near the Jarl on the high seat and come down to you with her thrall women serving foods and drinks and maybe having a pleasant chat with your cousin's wife. And you just struck by the beauty of her brooch, will utter the word Grimnir, which will of course cause a reaction with the lady of the house, because she's also part of the upper class. She knows poetry, she is an intellectual herself, and she will of course ask where this came from, whereupon your dear cousin will point out for the lady of the house and the wife of the Jarl that you are from a much respected family in Iceland and do know the art of skaldic poetry. In fact, you are a skald yourself. The lady of the house will ask for more, whereupon you will apologize for the slip that made you quote some poetry, because you come from a respectable family and do know you cannot do that such a thing unless you have the permission of her closest male kin. You blame your mischief on the meat, the beautiful, tasty meat that is being served tonight and that she must have been brewing all year. The meat that is so good and so strong that it makes your head spin and also made you forget your manners. The lady of the house will appreciate your observance of etiquette. As a reward, she will invite you to follow her up to the high seat where her husband sits and introduce you, and will see to that the Jarl will lend to you his ear. And so you begin to improvise a poem that is inspired by the pictures on the brooch, because you do not really improvise. You have already learned from your cousin's wife all about this magnificent brooch, which is the envy of every lady in the neighborhood. And you will start your poem with a Katie alluding to Grimni, the masked one. And the Jarl will look at his wife's brooch and recognize Grimnir. Then you will draw a kenning that alludes to Odin's adventure when he was stealing the meat of poetry from the giant Suttungr, by seducing his daughter Gunnlöd, who was guarding the cauldron that contained the meat of poetry deep in a mountain. So Odin transformed himself into a little beast that was digging down to Gunnlöd, was sitting deep in the mountain. Scanning will of course be reflected in the brooch of the Jarl's wife, which shows the face of Grimnir turning into a little gripping beast. The next step, you weave in another kenning that alludes to the fact that Odin, down in the mountain, made love to Gunnlöd and convinced her to give him a little clunk of the meat of poetry, but then only to deceive her and drink all of it. Which seemed the natural thing to do, because you say, with a wink in your eye towards the lady of the house, the meat that for poetry was as tasty as the one that is served tonight as the hall of the Jarl. Then you continue with another kenning that reflects what happened then when Odin fled the scene of the crime, switching his human form into the shape of a bird and flying away, leaving poor Gunnlöd behind, who would cry tears as she had been a friar of the salty seas. Of course alludes to the fact that Freya had been shedding golden tears when she was desperately longing for her husband Freyr. And when the Jarl and his wife are looking at the brooch, they will of course see both transformation from Odin's human shape into a bird, and maybe also a female figure that seems to be shedding tears. And so you conclude your poem, and there is absolute silence in the entire hall. People do wonder, was it a good poem or bad? Did he insult the Jarl? And suddenly the Jarl is starting to chuckle and laugh. And the entire hall is chuckling and laughing with him, as Jarl of course happens to be the most educated person of them all, and just has been solving the riddle by realizing every kenning in your poem was just a high praise of him as the most cunning and giving and heroic Odin of the meat that ever was. And as a reward for this gift, the Jarl will give you a sword, meaning that you are now part of his retinue. You will be allowed to follow him along on his military expeditions to gather wealth and glory, and that you once in a distant future will be returning to Iceland with many, many gifts from him that will be handed down to your children and children's children and become the stuff that legends are made of. So this little tale I've just been telling you is another possibility how animal art might have been working in the context of skaldic poetry. That is, as a resource that could evoke pictures in the eyes of the beholder whenever someone quoted poetry like an audio guide that emphasized certain pictures, to then flip-flop these pictures by the art of the canning and presenting a new pictures that on a conceptual level represented the exact opposite of what just had been said before. This, dear friends, leads us to the third possibility of why animal art and skaldic poetry might be such parallel phenomena. This solution founds of the possibility that these kind of broaches and poetry never met in the context I just described for you. So why would there then be contextual and conceptual and pictorial parallels to such a high degree? And the simple solution could be that animal art worked as a material anchor to preserve culturally significant memories and concepts as the fundamental difference between land and sea, air and water, integration and disenfranchisement, between culture and nature, between animal and human being, and even between the male and the female sphere. It is a binary division which we believe was very prevalent in the aristocratic milieu that handed down its poetry upon us, even though we also need to consider the possibility that these were values not shared by other segments of Viking Age society that might have had a totally different view on gender boundaries and sexual activity. And with these words, ladies and gentlemen, everyone in between or beyond, I invite you to continue your reading by taking the article on material anchors and to connect back to me with the questions, because after all, this is part of your mandatory reading curriculum. Many thanks so far, and see you at our next lecture.